Right, welcome. So I'm Mary Ryan, I'm the Vice Provost for Research and Enterprise at Imperial College, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to the launch of our Deep Tech Institute. I hope we're going to have a really interesting conversation this evening. We have a great speaker that will need no introduction, but I am going to introduce you anyway, Kate. Quick notice just about the evening. If there is a fire alarm, we're not expecting any tests. So if there's a fire alarm, exit the building. There are exits on both ends, and we gather in the front. And just to note, this event is being live streamed and recorded. So just for your information. So the Institute for Deep Tech Entrepreneurship is our new flagship program as part of the Imperial Academic Strategy and part of our mission to deliver impact and benefit to society from our fundamental research and education in the college. Why here and why now? We're launching here in White City, part of our innovation ecosystem at Imperial College. And why now? Well, we are at a critical moment. We're all aware of the many, what I might say is existential crises facing us, from climate change to food security and energy security and health and beyond. Those challenges have the solution, I think, at their heart in innovation and how innovation couples more broadly to policy and regulation and business models. And at Imperial College, we want to convene in that sphere all those different parts within this institute. So tonight we'll have an opportunity to discuss some of the challenges and the frictions that exist in really accelerating innovation to solve our global challenges. And I'm hopeful that you'll all join in the conversation that we're going to have after our plenary speaker. That's going to be with Ramana and Kate. Thank you for coming. So Kate, you can always tell when you ask a woman for her bio because it's excruciatingly small and really not doing justice to all of your achievements. But I will introduce you anyway. So to Kate, as you all know, chaired the UK Vaccine Task Force in 2020. She led a team, and I think it's really important, the team that she led there convened science, academia and government to find and manufacture the COVID-19 vaccines. And the UK was the first Western country to start vaccination, December 2020. She's worked in biotech venture for 30 years and is managing partner at SV Health Investors. SV Investments is a company creation approach to biotech investing, and you've launched over 20 drugs, including the treatment for patients with inflammatory and autoimmune disease. I will leave you all to add further embellishments to your illustrious career. But for now, I would thank you for joining us and welcome Dame Kate Bingham.
Thank you. So thank you very much for having me, and I'm sorry it was even longer than I meant it to be on the bio. So and it's a bit alarming also, hold on before I just take these out, to actually be talking about deep tech, because I've spent a long time trying to work out if I know what deep tech actually is. But what I was planning to do was talk a little bit about how you take really risky, unknown, high potential science and turn them into businesses. And let me see if I do this. Okay, so I'm going to start off because if you ask a venture capital a question, a venture capitalist, everything I see is through the lens of venture capital. So I'm going to just start with that so you can see where I'm coming from and why I don't think pure venture capital is necessarily the right solution, albeit I think we need to pick up some of the best things to do with venture capital. So this is all the bio you gave just now, but the important thing is the stuff in red. So much stuff has failed. Clinical trials have failed. Preclinical experiments didn't work. Deals you thought were happening didn't happen. You hire wrong people. You run out of money. So this is the 30 years I've spent. I mean, it's very nice to have the ticks where it works, but the size of the boxes are not proportional with actually where we spend our time. So we're really used to risk and failure. And so that was the mindset I came to the Vaccine Task Force. And here's a slide for those of you who were here when I came to speak before. This is the only repeated slide, but it's really important. So there's sort of the three sort of key lessons that I think made the VTF work was that we did actually partner incredibly effectively with industry, with academia, and importantly with government. And we were able to bring in a team of real experts who knew each and every aspect of what we needed to do. And it was that partnership, no matter what area you're in, if you've got what's likely to be a very tough goal, you need to have everybody on your side to try and help you. So if you remember, when the VTF was set up in May 2020, there had been no vaccine for any human coronavirus. And the most advanced vaccine format had never been approved by any regulator ever. And it normally took 5 years at least to develop a vaccine. So the odds were massively against us. So the partnership for us was a massive, important starting point. Speed is not normally what you associate with the government, but that was something, again, that having alignment in terms of the goals and what we're trying to achieve and being able to make decisions quickly and decisions that respond to data. Because, of course, you're making decisions with the best data you have at the time, but as soon as you get new data, you may need to adjust and pivot. So that, again, as a lesson of how we work, I think is important. And then risk, because we're dealing with uncertainty all the time. We know that most of what we do is going to fail. So that gets into portfolio strategy and how you think about building the investments, whether as a VC or whether in vaccines, so that you can try and mitigate some of those risks. So those are the sort of the key themes that I came in with. And I was very pleased that Ramana pointed this out to me. So I found this data in The Economist, which basically reinforces the value of venture capital-backed businesses. So 8 of the top 10 largest companies by market cap were backed and formed originally with venture capital dollars. And obviously, they're all household names. And then when you actually look at those companies that are public, very few companies actually that ultimately go public that are set up in the US are set up with venture dollars, yet over 3/4 of public companies received venture money. So it's absolutely disproportionate in terms of the impact of these venture-backed companies. And importantly, given the context of what we're talking about today, over 60% of venture-backed companies venture-backed companies represent over 60% of US public R&D spending of those companies. Now that, again, tells you that this is a good model. If you can get into venture, you're likely to be successful, but also you're likely to be able to continue with that R&D spend and really start turning scientific ideas into whatever the products are they're developing. And apparently these stats came originally from a paper and work that Ramana did a long time ago, which The Economist then repeated, which is what I saw. But thank you for the underlying data, because I think it's incredibly helpful. And it's not to say venture capital is the solution to everything, but it clearly is a very valuable and important way to back uncertain, risky businesses. Now, I put this in just to remind everybody that, yes, you can see on the top end, the top performing venture funds will perform very well. So you can see, north of 40% net IRRs, so net internal rate of return back to investors net of fees. So if you hit a top performing fund, you can make a lot of money. And of course, each fund itself will be investing in multiple investments. But you look at the bottom end, and of course, you can lose a lot of money. And then you compare that to global equity, and you can see it's much tighter in terms of the top performers and the worst performers. So you can get high risks, you get high returns, but also you can get a lot of high losses. And then when you take that into my field in drug discovery and drug development, you double the risk, because the likelihood of approval of a new drug, and can you see it? Well, you probably can't see it enough, but basically it looks at phase 2 in the sort of sick-coloured green, and phase 3 likelihood of approval in red. But the important line, if you can see the actual line, is the overall likelihood of approval according to these different clinical indications. And you can see it goes from 18% down to 7%. So and on average is about 10%. So 1 in 10 of new drugs that are developed will make it, that get into the clinic, will get approved. So you're talking a massive odds against you already. So combine that again with the losses and the potential range in venture. This is not a investment class for the weak-hearted. So how do you how do you mitigate some of those risks? So the first thing you do is you build a portfolio where you try to spread your potential risks across, in this case, I've given you lots of different indications, lots of different types of drug format, and within that, lots of different stages, so that we can try and offset losses with potential big winners. And of course, we did the same thing with the vaccine task force too. So we took the broad types of different vaccine, and then we picked the best vaccines from within each of those different classes. So the approach is exactly the same. We did, obviously, if you're building these very high-risk businesses, and in our case, we invest about 2/3 of our investments are in companies we've set up ourselves. So we just want to make sure that we have the best kick-ass experts who can come in and help us build those companies and think about all the bear traps that we want to try and avoid. And again, we did the same thing with the vaccine task force. And you fund against milestones. So you don't just write a check and say, I'll see you in 5 years' time, let me know how you get on. You actually sit down and work out what are the key value inflection points, and what, if you don't reach that point, where you're going to draw the line and say, okay, right, we're cutting you off and we're now going to double down on another company. So again, we did exactly the same thing in the vaccine task force, and we did not invest the whole way through with all the different things we looked at, and we had very clear milestones. And of course, in biotech, actually you don't get a lot of value uplift really until you've got big clinical data. And so this is a schematic, and you can argue as to what the right sort of metrics are. But by and large, you have to show that your drug works in patients, at least in a small number of patients, before anyone's going to take you seriously. And it's a lot of money to get there. And these numbers are probably a bit light, if anything. So it's not unusual that you'd be spending several $100 million before you get to that efficacy signal in patients. So what does all this mean? Oh, and then singular focus on goals. So, I mean, these were the 20 drugs that we've funded. And again, we are pure red-blooded venture capitalists. So we are primarily driven by returns to investors. But the way we do it is by developing drugs that will have disproportionate effects on patients, not just sort of minor me toos, but ones where we think we can really make a difference, because we think in those ways we're going to get paid more. And then, of course, in vaccines, we did the same thing. And the only one that's of the vaccines we backed that's not yet approved is the one that I thought was the shoo-in, so the GSK Sanofi vaccine. So all the other ones have been approved and not necessarily on the market. Well, the government never took it up, but all the rest are there. So that's the sort of the background to venture and why I think venture as a tool of investing in high-risk businesses works quite well. And we've got lots of ways to mitigate with incentives and tranching and portfolio and so on. And so then thinking about the challenges today, I've pulled up the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, many of these do relate to health. And then specifically, you can start thinking about curing big chronic diseases, infectious disease, and so on. And then starting to think about access to healthcare, health inequalities. I mean, again, the vast bulk of clinical trials are on Caucasians, and we're not necessarily developing drugs across different ethnic minorities and so on. So how can venture actually work to tackle some of these major challenges facing society? And I've put a bunch of sort of top of my head ideas of some of the things where I think specifically this forum and generally novel science can really make a contribution to changing the way we actually manage human health. So whether synthetic biology, creating new enzymes, new proteins, doing things that you're not just necessarily adapting or modifying what nature has done, but can we do things completely de novo, whether it's cell therapy, AI models? I mean, we use a lot of mice in developing new drugs, and it's obviously all controlled by legislation. But can we get to a point where we can actually do a lot of this testing in silico as opposed to in cats, dogs, and as I said, cats, dogs, and Europeans, because we tend to run a lot of clinical trials over here before they go to the States. So I think there's a vast amount of things that we can do to think about the big health challenges. But the question is, how can you do that in the context of the financing models that we've got now, notwithstanding the fact that I think venture's pretty good. So I've used this as an example because clearly it's been absolute knockout success. So mRNA was actually first discovered in the early 60s and then starting to look at key applications in the 70s. Then a Hungarian lady started trying to think about what can we do. So this lady Kariko, and she moved ultimately to America and started trying to do what we can do now, which is inject the mRNA into cells and get the cells to start manufacturing the protein that's encoded in that mRNA. And it didn't work, and it didn't work, and it didn't work. But she persevered and collaborated with different people. And eventually started getting it working. And the seminal papers that were coming out with sort of 2005, 2006. And again, that started getting an appetite on the commercial side, in part because the US legislation for manipulation of human embryos was very tight. So actually using mRNA to create stem cells was a way to bypass the use of human embryos. And so that was in part how it started. And then Rossi then picked up on this and said, right, let's see if we can set up a company to start systematically using this technique across a whole bunch of things, whether it's infectious disease, cancer, different ways of modifying immune responses. And that's when Moderna, which was modified RNA, that's how the company was originally named, was set up in 2010. Now, it was highly unusual in lots of respects. So it raised a ton of money. So by the time it went public, it had already spent $1.5 billion, hadn't had a single positive result in any clinical trial. And the investors were largely sovereign wealth and family offices through Flagship. So a rather unusual background, because mostly you would not raise that level of funding without more positive clinical data coming out of it. And I pulled this little schematic. That was in its S1 with Goldman's. Just to give you a range, there were a lot of programs in this company. Some were partnered. The purple bar halfway, 3/4 of the way down is with AstraZeneca. But the idea was, here is a pretty exciting technology. We're not quite sure which ones of these are going to work. So we're going to try lots of different approaches and see where we can get a clinical signal. They went public in 2018, very tail end of 18. And in the S1, Goldman's predicted they would have $17 billion of sales in 2035. And in fact, they hit that last year. So what happened was obviously the COVID pandemic massively accelerated the funding that went into this technology. So this technology had already been slightly unusually financed. So it was very much a unicorn that stood out, being very different from most biotechs. And it got but it worked, and it's very similar in type to the Pfizer vaccine or the BioNTech vaccine. So it gets approved, and then you can see the share price went completely nuts. And so although we're down off the peak, its market cap now is $50 billion. And so, I mean, it's the size of a small pharmaceutical company, effectively based on one drug. And of course, that's down from $150 billion at its peak. So I give that as an example of, here is a venture-backed company that has changed the way in which we deliver healthcare, but it was a perfect storm. So it was technology accelerated, massive influx of funding, an unusually well-financed company before it even went public, and from sources which were non-traditional. So this is a beautiful example, but I don't think it's a replicable example. And I think if you say every deal we're going to do is going to look like Moderna, I don't think investors would believe you. So the main challenges we have from looking at a view from a venture perspective is typically these are 10-year funds. And even though no venture fund ever actually closes in 10 years, we all go out and pitch it, but we never close in 10 years. and you always have to extend, and then eventually you stop taking the fees and you continue to return any proceeds back to investors as they get there. Nevertheless, we do have a rhetoric that these are technically 10-year funds, which doesn't fit, by and large, with long, uncertain, risky, R&D intense investments. And of course, investors that come into our funds are coming in to get us, with a target rate of return. And if they thought they could only get what the level of return they would get in the public stock markets, then they wouldn't take on the risks of coming into a venture fund. So they only come into a venture fund in order to get that potential for alpha, but recognizing they could be losing money. So that's a massive constraint because, again, there's just limits to the, you're not going to be able to deliver those returns if those returns come in 20 years. And of course, the financing environment has a big effect on how venture capitalists think about how they invest. And right now, no one is flocking to write money into really long-term, high cash needy businesses because we don't see where the money's coming from, certainly not with the public markets right now, and we can't quantify the technical risks. So those are the challenges of going into something really, really early, even though by and large, when venture does go into those businesses, they do pretty well. So the businesses do, as I showed you, disproportionately well. So we do need a different solution to how you're going to continue to find the next mRNA treatment where you don't have to rely on all these perfect storms coming together to actually succeed. So, of course, I think we need to have a close partnership between academia funding and governments, but I think they need to be different in terms of the types of investors. Academia, which is why I think it's brilliant to be here, because I think Imperial can contribute so much across the different fields of innovative science. And if we've got any members of government here, I think it'd be really good if government can get more literate to actually understand what the scope of some of these potential, scientific advances could be. So thinking then about the funding, I've just pulled out these stats on impact investors. And this is definitely a big move in the sector as I see it. So, of course, we have pension funds and insurance companies and the big asset managers who will allocate a small amount into what they call alternative assets. And mostly alternative is private equity. So these are revenue-generating businesses with debt that you can leverage and get returns that way. And an even a teeny tiny portion will go into venture. But there is a very growing, significantly growing part of the market, which are these impact investors, where they want to get financial returns, but they also want a very clear social return as well. Now, the vast bulk are climate funds. GIN, which is the Global Investment Network, Society, whatever it's called, have cited that they think it's about $700 billion that were invested in impact by impact investors in 2019. But actually, IFC say it's about 3 times that. So I think the fact that we've got a lot of vagueness as to about what it is means it's not yet a clear industry. But there is a growing area of impact investors who want to do more. And I think this is something that we absolutely need to capitalize on. So those investors who are willing to take a longer term time frame and either invest in these companies or these new ideas and technologies themselves, or get it to a point at which a more traditional venture investor can say, yes, I can now understand the time frame and the cost to get to a potential inflection point. So impact for me is a big source, and I can't read it, so I'm sure you can't, but the big half, the 50-odd% in blue, those are for-profit asset managers who are putting this money in, and then the rest is not-for-profits, foundations, family offices. So I think there are a range of investors that can really help on this impact space. Now, government funding, I think, is going to continue to be important. And there, I think we need to, and so ARIT obviously is a potential huge opportunity in this country with unconstrained funding of 800 sterling for the next 3 years. And that's been heavily modelled on the US DARPA. And that, again, DARPA has been hugely influential in building up innovative businesses in Silicon Valley and so on. Wellcome has Wellcome Leap. So again, trying to get this same idea of how can you invest in things which have the potential to be absolutely transformational and again, disproportionately effective. So I think those are, and that obviously charities, CF Foundation, again, they stepped in, and we're seeing this more and more in medical charities, where instead of just handing out grants to say, tell us more about, this particular pathway or this cell or this whatever, they're starting to really focus on how can you translate and turn the breaking science actually into something that is going to have a clinical impact on patients. And CF was famous when nobody was funding the actual potential CF drugs where you're addressing the underlying mutant chloride ion channel. Everybody was developing drugs to deal with the symptoms of cystic fibrosis. And eventually the CF Foundation said, you know what, we think this particular approach to affect the chloride ion channel itself, which is the mutant which causes the disease, they put a lot of money in and they won, and they've made billions as a result of doing that. And it has really obviously changed the CF Foundation's balance sheet, but it's been a poster child for other medical research charities to say, how can you actually use your dollars more effectively to actually have the patient impact so that you actually end up with drugs? And AR UK obviously is another example in Alzheimer's at a different scale. So I think there are investors out there which are not the traditional venture investors who have shown themselves to be willing to take longer term views in making investments which may border on philanthropy, that have the potential to be really game-changing. And then I've also put in, as well as these new investors, we need to have new metrics to evaluate performance, because you can't just use the same, oh, well, what's your IRR performance over these long-term projects, because we're going to have to think of better ways to show are these dollars being spent effectively, and when can you start actually testing to see what that looks like? And it needs to go beyond sort of box checking ESG greenwash stuff. It's got to be genuine impact measures to say, is this being effective? And of course, I advertise my own fund, Dementia Discovery Fund, which is really an impact fund. So this is what it says on the tin, which is in dementia, we've had such a single-minded focus in a very narrow set of biological pathways. So it's basically the ApoE pathway for Alzheimer's, with the thesis that you get these big sticky plaques that grow in your brain, which somehow kills neurons and something somehow kills you. Now, genetically, all of that is ApoE is all linked, but we haven't got a single drug that has shown clinical efficacy that by removing the plaques actually helps with delaying or slowing down the course of the disease. So the thesis of this fund is very much, let's look at all the different other pathways. We don't talk about cancer anymore. We talk about, HER2 positive or triple negative breast cancer. And drugs are now getting approved based on the mechanism, as an underlying mechanism of disease that causes those diseases, not where the actual, in case of cancer, not where the ultimate tumour's organ is found. So we want to apply those same ideas and start unpicking. So, in 10 years' time, we won't be talking about Alzheimer's. We'll be talking about, X pathway-driven dementia and another Y. And of course, it'll be multifactorial, just like cancer is. And of course, this is going to be more complex because it's slower and much harder to unpick. And so much happens asymptomatically. But nevertheless, the investors in this fund are these strategic investors that you would expect to come into a fund like this. So it is the pharmaceutical industry who want an early look at what are the new things, and then the things that look successful they can double down on and invest in. It's philanthropists like Bill Gates personally that's come in. It's foundations like, we've got the NFL Players Association. I mean, again, that's another interesting example. And then actually the biggest investor in this fund is the American Association of Retired People. So AARP, big, I was going to say foundation, but I'm not sure that's quite right in America. And what they want to show to their, probably it's the biggest membership group of older people in the world, they want to show they're actually putting their membership dues into something that could have an effect, and it's the single biggest thing that they're concerned about. So here is it is a venture fund, but it's very clearly an impact fund, and it is incredibly difficult to raise money and incredibly difficult to fundraise for these sorts of companies. But it is the way that I think we're going to see deep tech working. Breakthrough Energy is a Gates fund. These are 20-year funds without a formal returns target, but with a very clear social target to actually, solve climate change, basically. And they're $1 billion each. So they're not small change. They do invest in companies. So again, they're not necessarily doing lots of seeding of new ideas, but they are writing checks to support really fundamental new technologies. And of course, we've got, while we're here today, we've got the Imperial Deep Tech Fund, which I know at the moment is small, but that's something that I think follows on exactly the same theme, which is how can we fund some of these nascent, potentially transformational ideas in a way that we can get the data set and the trajectory to a point where you can then start bringing in big money and really starting to fund properly. And of course, there are other changes that we would need to do alongside the new source of funding. I mean, we do need to get the academic funding groups to stop this ridiculous idea that as soon as it moves from pure science, they will no longer fund. And we've just got to get the mindset of, just like we're seeing with the medical research charities, which is, yes, we want to fund the underlying research that will help understand the disease and the progression of different indications. But actually, we want to turn those insights into products that can actually help the patients that we're doing the research for to begin with. So at the moment, it is like church and state, and as you know, this is research and this is applied, and we won't fund applied. So that, I think, needs to change. We need to build infrastructure to help fund these ideas, whether it's digital, whether it's physical infrastructure, whether it's IP support. And again, we're in the perfect place to do that, embedded with hospitals, with academic experts, and with an entrepreneurial environment. So this is exactly what I think. I think we're in a very good place to do this. Training scientists, I think, really matters, because scientists can think often, I'm really good at whatever impossible stuff that I don't understand. They do. But the fact is, and again, this is your work, peer-to-peer training also is incredibly effective. So if you have a workplace where you've got some entrepreneurs and people who are experienced and can help, that will be an incredibly effective way to stimulate ongoing entrepreneurship. And so again, that level of training, and MIT is known for training their scientists in accounting. I mean, we have to be able to get scientists to be more literate. And we've seen it in the COVID pandemic, how effective actually in many ways scientists have been in communication about what it is they're doing and why it matters, and getting it to levels that the general public understand. And so we need that. So I think there's a big role, and again, where else to do it other than at Imperial? I think this is a key role that needs to be thought about. And then obviously my normal rant about government literacy and collaboration, because ultimately the government is going to be playing a big role in all of these things, because if these really are genuinely transformational technologies, ideas, solutions, whatever they are, the government is going to have to be buying them, supporting them, employing them, deploying them, all those sorts of things. So we need to make sure the whole thing is joined up. But I think we're in a great place to start, and we need to just keep pushing. So that's where I was going to stop, and then we can get on to the Q&A or the panel.
Thank you. Have a seat. So I'd also introduce Professor Ramananda. Pick your space. Professor of Entrepreneurial Finance here in the Business School at Imperial College. Prior to joining Imperial, you were at Harvard Business School for about 14 years, is that right? And your research, as we've heard, is about understanding these financing frictions and challenges of scale-up and startups. So Ramana is also the founding director of the Imperial Institute for Deep Tech Entrepreneurship. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Just a quick note. I am going to come to the room for questions. If you could wait till somebody brings you a microphone for that. I'm sure we will hear you in the room, but people online won't if we don't have the microphone. So just bear with us. But I did want to start. I'm going to come to you, Ramana. Just to talk a little bit more about what you think the role of universities is in this broader ecosystem. And are we going to be a science superpower? And how are universities a part of that?
Fantastic. So thank you again, Kate, for such a wonderful introduction and teeing up this panel perfectly. Music to my ears.
Citing your work.
A lot of the stuff is exactly how I think about the world as well. So thank you. I think the way in which we've been conceptualizing and thinking about the Deep Tech Institute is very much in line with what Kate was talking about, which is that we believe that there are these moonshot ideas out there that could be incredibly valuable if only they get to the point where the private capital markets can pick them up. But for a variety of reasons, there's frictions in that process. And for very good reason, we have venture capitalists who are not willing to engage at that very, very early stage. And those frictions, we think, are multidimensional. There's clearly the technical side of things. So sometimes these are not to the point where they really have hit the technical milestones where they can prove the level of value inflection or be at a point where you can price this from a VC standpoint. There's issues around value creation and capture. This is where the government obviously can play a very big role in helping to be a customer, a backstop demand, but also at the same time universities can think about using IP as a strategic asset rather than just thinking of it as a cost. And then there's the human capital side, which you talked about, which I think we see as a very important part of what we can do to help. And then the last part being the sort of the commercialization model and the non-dilutive capital that can help achieve all of that. And in part, what we want to do is to be this blend between a university environment where we can have the physical and the digital infrastructure to do the science, but also to try to develop more of a commercial mindset, keep people to the timelines that they commit to, help them achieve the value inflection that they would like to achieve, and in doing so, reduce those frictions and get them to that point. So that's very much the goal. I think you asked something about science superpower.
Yeah.
You've heard me say this before, but one of the things that I have, one of my colleagues at HBS talks about a lot is that if you look at the history of agglomerations over time, you'll see that, in the 1700s, Lowell, Massachusetts was the Silicon Valley of its time. And then in the 1900s, it was Pittsburgh and Cleveland as steel and electricity became the frontier, and Sheffield that became the frontier technologies. We then moved to, in the US, Detroit, and then Boston with the mini computer. And then it was only really in the last, 50, 60, 70 years that we've got to the point where Silicon Valley has captured our imagination and is where all the action is at. And so I guess for me, I take two things from that. One, as frontier technologies evolve, you're not necessarily stuck in the last place where the agglomeration was happening. And if you're thinking from a policy standpoint to engage and help bring things along, you want to catch the next wave rather than trying to replicate the last wave. And so in that sense, I think with the UK's strong science, proximity to global capital markets, great entrepreneurs, certainly a government that has shown the ability to at times play an incredible role as a partner, I think those are all sets of things that, as you mentioned, are ones that we need for a vibrant deep tech ecosystem. So I'm personally quite bullish about the possibility of achieving that, although whether or not we go about that will depend on a whole bunch of things coming together, obviously, which are not guaranteed.
Okay, interesting. And we may well poll the room for what the next big wave is likely to be, probably after over drinks. Kate, I want to come to you. So we talked a little bit about policy, financing, and ways to do that. And of course, as you showed with the Vaccine Task Force, the regulator has a really key role in enabling translation to be rapid. Could you just talk a little bit about your experience of working with regulators and what are their challenges, I guess, locally and globally, and how we bring, I guess, regulation and regulators into this conversation?
So, I mean, first of all, the MHRA, which is our regulator, is completely independent, as in they will make their own decisions, and they were just phenomenal in vaccines. So, historically, in my experience historically of regulators, is you have to get all the paperwork completely dotted I's and crossed T's, and every time you go to have a meeting with a regulator, whether it's over here or in the States, you practice, you rehearse, you bring consultants in, you get vetted, you do it again and again until you literally have rehearsed everything up the wazoo to make sure that you really have explored every single thing they might ask and what you want to get out of it and so on. And that's been obviously effective, and people have got their drugs approved or not. But what MHRA did during the pandemic was recognise that that was one of the bottlenecks in getting vaccines approved and therapeutics approved. And I think it was in part also because of the UK vote for Brexit, they had to work out what they were going to be when they grew up, because the EMA was based over here, and so the MHRA did a disproportionate share of medicines regulation historically. And so then when the EMA moved out and moved to Amsterdam, they had to work out, well, what are we going to be and what are we going to do, and how can we persuade drug companies to file for approval in Europe, file for their approval in the US, as well as file for their approval in dinky little UK that doesn't pay, tuppence for a drug. So they were already starting to think about how can they be creative and how can they make themselves attractive to pharmaceutical companies and drug companies as a regulator. And so they changed their approach to effectively become, again, goes back to my partnership theme, to become partners to drug companies rather than policemen. And so June Rain, who runs MHRA, talks about moving from being a policeman to an air traffic controller. So she's there to help the planes get in and help the vaccine companies or drug companies actually get their drugs to patients without crashing along the way. But the key point is she starts way before they're anywhere close to landing. So opening up this idea that share with us the data you've got, even if it's incredibly incomplete, so that we can start giving you feedback and we can start reviewing at least what you've got, so that by the time you're close to the runway and about to land and then you give us that data, we've got everything else assessed so that we can make a decision. And it was very notable that on the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, they did not run those clinical trials here in the UK. So we had no particular edge. We had none of the principal investigators or anybody that was sort of giving us an early insight or anything like that over here. All the trials were run, the regulatory trials were run in the States. And yet, because of June's approach of saying, well, give us the data, the non-clinical data, give us your manufacturing data, give us your quality data. Let's look at all of that before you've got the final phase 3 efficacy data. And they were able to review it and turn it around before the FDA. Now that is astonishing. And it does show that idea of a partnership, and actually you're both trying to achieve the same thing, which is to make sure that safe and effective vaccines actually get approved. And they were able to do so, and they were able to do so faster than all the other regulators. Now, one of the risks that we faced, of course, with vaccines was did we run the risk that the MHRA, in their keenness to show how flexible and collaborative they were, would they potentially approve things which other regulators would not approve? Because that, again, would be highly damaging to everybody. And it was incredibly important that they use the same standards that they've always used, which, again, comparable with other regulators. So there was no sense of, well, MHRA only approved the AZ vaccine because it was British, but no other regulator in the world would approve it. So we were in that tension between how can we do things incredibly quickly and get the regulator to work effectively and collaboratively with us, but absolutely not change the standards, because that any sense that there was any sort of favoritism or lowering standards would have been disastrous. And I think they did it beautifully. They managed it.
And do you think those learnings will be embedded? I mean, because that's a whole cultural shift in an emergency, right, which seemed to work. And you might argue that actually you end up with a safer system because you have a more open relationship between the two parties. Is it reverting back to business as usual, or is that a longer term trajectory?
Hard to know. because
let me ask it a different way then. I guess you've said the partnership, but the key learnings that we should try to capture.
I mean, if I were sitting in June Rain's position and I don't know what the budgeting looks like or what all of our other constraints are, I would for sure be wanting to embed that process because it's clearly proven to be effective. And putting a sort of UK PLC hat on, we're never going to be the first port of call for any pharma company ever to come to the UK because, you know, we have an NHS system and where we don't pay for a lot of money for therapeutics. We're well known to be tight. And so we're never going to get in on the commercial size of market because that's just not going to happen. It's not an argument about budget. It's just never going to happen. So we can only get in by being nimble, effective, again, collaborative country where you can say, look, you come to us, we will get your drug or vaccine or whatever it is into clinical trials quicker than anybody else. We will get that data for you quicker than anybody else. We will get it approved quicker. So then you can start getting real world data. And if you remember, even after the vaccines were approved, we still didn't actually know really how the vaccines were going to work in the wider population because you'd still only tested these in 40, 50,000 people. And so as soon as you start going into 40 million people and 400 million people, you're going to start getting feedback on the performance of the vaccine, which goes way beyond what you can actually test in a clinical trial. So again, I think the opportunity, if I was sitting on running the MHRA, is how can you make the UK the most effective place to come in and do that experimental work because we're highly diverse. We've got an incredible network. You know, we have electronic medical records so that you can actually go back to people's records so you can really understand what are the underlying diseases and they're largely accessible if we could have strong IT to link it all together. So I mean, there's still lots of issues, and we tie ourselves up in governance and patient privacy. But fundamentally, there's no other country in the world that has this depth of data across such a diverse group with such joined up medical records. We all have NHS numbers, and if we give consent, people can look at our records, and that is the way to get. And we've seen through the pandemic the importance of clinical research. So the fact that The Sun was starting with one of their headlines where they were describing the risk of potential side effects of the Oxford vaccine, the AZ vaccine, and their headline was a statistic, 0.0000001% chance that you would ever have any harm. That shows to me that clinical research is higher in the national psyche, which means we should be better able to be that sort of test bed and early experimental place that people come to.
And then turn the NHS into an asset in that sense.
Hopefully.
Okay. Anyone in the room have a question? Yeah, go ahead. Have we got a microphone? Yeah.
I can speak very loud.
I know, but it's the online people. I'm sure we would hear you.
Yeah, thank you for a fascinating conversation. In your experience, when you develop a vaccination or therapeutics, go to the market and scale model, is it based on your preference or in your experiences, a single medication or single vaccine company, or working with a much larger pharmaceutical company who may have a much larger infrastructure and therefore their ability to scale it a lot quicker? So what is your experience between these two models here?
For us, it's always been to partner with a bigger pharma company. Right. So the only times we've ever tried to take a drug to market ourselves is in a super rare niche orphan indication where you can actually start to build that infrastructure yourself. But otherwise, pharma companies are just vastly better. Yeah. They are I think of them a bit like film distribution. Fox and Disney and CNN. You've got all the sort of creative producers and the little film companies that come up with all the ideas. But actually, when it comes to distribution, making them, getting them out, marketing, and getting them around the world, you need the scale. And
sorry, just quick follow-up. How does the economics works in that, the commercial arrangement? Broadly speaking, principles of it, yeah.
Normally, the pharma companies will just buy the biotech. So then the equity investors, so the VCs will get paid out on that, or if it's a public company, then the public investors will get paid out. If it's just licensing a drug, then it'll be typically milestone and royalties, and sometimes then you'll get sales milestones as well. But it's certainly not a massively lopsided deal, because the smaller companies simply don't have the scale to invest in that level of marketing, of manufacturing, regulatory around the world, distribution. I mean, these are big logistical challenges which little nimble companies don't have the skills or the money for.
I think kind of linking back to this sort of deep tech, that's a challenge in the sense that in the biotech world, this, the value chain or the innovation value chain is much better developed. I wonder whether you think that, in some sense, the IP strategies are better understood, that the biotech companies of large pharma companies understand that they need to buy at certain prices, otherwise they won't get the deal flow the next time round, and whether we have the same in energy or in materials or in other sectors where we don't have necessarily as good a market for ideas.
Yeah, I don't know.
We don't have the same pathway. I mean, Peter wants to comment as well. Peter's got a question, but this was a question I was going to pose to you, that when you look in deep tech across the sectors, where are the common challenges, right, and where are these distinct differences where the kind of research that you do might help us think about best practice to drive forward some of the innovations in energy, climate?
I think one
robotics.
big difference is that in the pharmaceutical world, the patents allow you to charge above everybody else. In a lot of other sectors, in energy, for example, unless you have a price on carbon, you have to compete with the person who's producing at the marginal cost on a fully depreciated asset. And so you not only have to be clean and better, but you also have to be cheaper, which then raises the bar in some sense in terms of how you innovate, which is where then the government's role in procurement and committing to buy at a certain price for a certain level of technology can become very important in helping these things go.
And I think investors can make a difference. I mean, impact investors, I think, will, in due course, absolutely alter. Businesses that are damaging the environment but making a profit will be diminished versus those that are making maybe a less for profit but having a proper accounting of, whether it's carbon accounting or whatever you call it, but there will be a broader way of assessing these businesses beyond just financial.
Okay. I think that's going to be true globally. So what do we need to do to make sure that the UK is the place where those clean businesses are the ones that are primed to move forward? I guess that's the question for the Institute. I think we had a Peter and then at the back. Yeah.
Thanks very much. I totally agree with what you say. I'd like to raise this issue of the stage at which you incorporate, because you've talked about venture funds and the like, which obviously will invest in formed companies. Our experience is that technologies have reached the stage of the running out of science funding way before they can sensibly incorporate, because not only are the technical milestones to reach any sensible value inflection, but also they haven't sorted a business model out, and they haven't got a team together. So they're going to be uninvestable, basically. So we've got this issue of the gap between being able to sensibly form a company, and at the moment, frankly, we're turning out a lot of companies too soon, often simply to attract smart grants, for example. But there's this issue of the time when you form it, and therefore the funding that we would like to get that will enable us to get technologies from the science funding stage through to the investable stage,
I think
preferably at a decent valuation.
I think that's exactly the gap. And so part of that can be addressed by the underlying academic funding grants, not stopping as soon as you start saying, we've got to something that's vaguely applied. Part of that is exactly what we're talking about here. So, and we don't have the same level of sort of incubators and accelerators here in the UK, I think, as we see in the US, where you have a lot of that training and low-level funding, but funding available to actually progress it. And I think we just need different sources of funding apart from anything else. I mean, what we do for the very early stuff is we will incorporate a company, but it's literally a £10 paper company, and we don't put any legals around it or anything other than what's called a SAFE, so a simple agreement for future equity. And we basically say, look, if this works, we'll convert this into equity, and if it doesn't, we just write it off. So we don't spend any money on the incorporation side, but it does allow us a vehicle that can pay bills. So that if we're, and typically that would be largely just with the academic and maybe with a CRO to replicate some of the data.
Yeah. Good. Question at the back. Richard.
Shall I go?
Yeah, go ahead.
So it's Richard Boyd. I was delighted how much time you spent on the investors. So obviously the venture capitalists are the asset managers, but then there are behind them the asset owners. And I do think I spend quite a lot of time with European family offices, and I do think there are some important changes happening there that will work in favour of what we're talking about, and that is the change of generation. So one is there is an accumulation. There has now been a substantial accumulation of private capital. A lot of many families now creating family offices with a more professional approach there, and as that generation comes through, they are reorienting much more towards impact investing. So I do think that there is a new category of asset owner who is in tune with what we'd all like to have happen. So I do think that, my question, I'm wondering whether there is an opportunity this is creating an opportunity for the asset managers, the venture capitalists in this case, to create impact venture capital funds, rather than, as you said earlier, Kate, I'm talking to, all I am looking for is making money for my LPs. Are the venture capitalists going to create some impact venture capital funds, or are they going to stick to what they're doing?
So the poster child for impact funds is Bridges, so that's Ronnie Cohen's group. And they've clearly got their different types of funds with, if you want a full-blooded return, then you're going to get minimal impact. And if you want maximum impact, then you may or may not get a return. I think it's been a great example about how to do it, but it hasn't spawned lots of peer funds, I think, yet. So our dementia fund is definitely, it was the first. Now, there is one other new dementia fund that's just been launched on the continent. But it's hard. And so you've got to have people that really have got religion to make this work, because it is much harder than to have that additional layer of impact over and above just investing in a pure for-profit company. But, you talk about the family offices on the continent. A lot of them did invest in Moderna. Mm-hmm. And actually, I think they would be susceptible to the argument to say, look, you've made a ton of money coming into Moderna, and fantastic investment, and it's absolutely catalysed the way that we think about vaccination and this whole new class. But it is not a reliable way of making investments, because so many things happen to come together at the right time and make it work. That how about putting money into a impact fund like this that can then bridge that period from the point that you described, when the sort of academics have got something, but you can't really grapple it yet, and you certainly can't have a trajectory of, if you invest this, then you get to Y.
I've sat in many family office meetings, and what scares them is that the fact that there isn't the average performance of the asset class hasn't been sufficient. That's what's going on, that massive dispersion that you showed in your chart, and that's why that's what we did. We go for rifle shooting because they don't have enough confidence in the average venture capitalist to deliver competitive returns. And so I think there's something.
Can I maybe reframe that and bring it to you, Ramana? Because we've talked around the houses about uncertainty and managing or making decisions under uncertainty, and how you kind of de-risk systems. So what do you think are the key, I guess, the key time points and the key, there's research questions in there, to enable us to address this uncertainty more proactively?
Yeah, and I think it's a little bit of matching the incentives of the class of capital with the uncertainty and risk that is being dealt with. And so in some sense, my preference is to think of this as a relay race rather than to think about this as blending return and impact, where you're not able to necessarily understand the trade-off between those. I think Ronnie has a very different measure. Ronnie Cohen has a different measure of impact in the sense that he says that, you know, if you are, with the impact accounting, they're trying to figure out a way to actually to put a dollar value on the impact. And so there's a way that you can kind of trade the two off. But if one person is interested in dementia and another person is interested in climate, it's very hard for them to understand the way you trade off return with that particular goodness, as it were. And so if you think about this as a relay race, it becomes a little easier, because then the people who care about dementia give to value inflection, de-risking for dementia projects, and get them to a point where a completely commercially minded investor would be willing to put money in. And so for them, the metric is how many of these projects are we able to get to a point where someone actually picks them up and goes. And so it's a little bit easier in my view to separate out the activities based on the specific goals that these classes of investors have, rather than trying to blend them.
Okay.
But I do think, Richard, I think there is a philanthropic element, because if the test of these impact funds is going to be they want to see 10 years of returns of making money in this space, they're never going to see that. So I think it's got to be a sort of a grease the wheel. You put some money in philanthropically, and if it works, yes, then you'll get a fantastic return. But it's basically to enable a new class of deals.
Okay. This one here.
My question was actually on the innovation ecosystem, to sort of think about the support. You talked about with the vaccine task force that the right people were brought to the table, and there was an urgency, but also there was a facilitator, curator to that taking place. So thinking about deep tech and other innovations that we want to see scale and move up the value chain, there's a sort of, for me, there's a stumbling block in that to get the right people around the table with that sort of longer term impact and outcome that's needed for that innovation. How do you see that getting translated across the innovation ecosystem? Because you can have it in little pockets in the case that's happened here, but for me it's the sort of wider behavioural change that needs to take place with the innovation, within the innovation ecosystem at a larger scale.
Do you want to tackle that?
Yeah, so, you know, I think it's culture change takes a while. I think to the extent that we can decentralize this and have lots of different experiments running, then we have the ability to learn from each other's successes and be inspired by what's happening. And so that's why I think it's great that we're doing this, but there's other people who are trying to find their own models. And in my view, it's very hard to start top down, because you put a policy in place. If you don't have the individuals who actually care and are motivated to do stuff, it's going to be very hard for that to happen. And so it's collections of people who come together, care deeply about this, make stuff happen in their own little way, and then other people begin to see, you know what, this is a model that's working, let's try to try and replicate it. I don't know if that answers your question, Geeta, but I think systemic change across an ecosystem is just really hard.
But, you know, value the entrepreneurs, get them to come back, get them to mentor new people. Just rub off as much as you can for entrepreneurs who've actually been successful or who failed, because actually failure is incredibly helpful. But just the fact that you're starting to think about again, with the scientists who are going to have a mindset historically of this is the work I'm working, you know, this is my area of expertise. In order to get to the next grant, I need to move there. And what we need to do is to not think about just the next grant, but, you know, how you're actually going to change completely. And that is a mindset shift that we need to.
The innovator, I get that. For me, it's the people who enable that. So you talked about the regulators, you talked about the other sort of public bodies. It's how do you get those groups to sort of come together with that bigger goal? Sorry.
I actually think that it's not. I mean, again, with the vaccine now, of course, we were in an emergency pandemic, and everybody was thinking, they're all locked up at home, thinking, well, what can we do to help? So, of course, when you call people and say, will you help? They'll say yes, and maybe that's not quite as prevalent as it, outside a pandemic. But actually, people who've got that depth of expertise, and you call them and say, we really would like you to help us do X, they'll often say yes. And, provided you don't make it too onerous and you make it possible for them to actually succeed, I think you can do. And I think, again, certainly people in the second half of their careers, once they've built a track record and a level of expertise, they are thinking about what is their contribution to the world and how are they. I mean, I call it sort of eulogy virtues versus CV virtues. They've checked off their CVs, they've passed their A-levels, they've got their degree, they've done all of that sort of stuff. And they're now starting to think about, well, what are people going to say when I'm dead and buried? And what is my contribution going to be? And actually, if you go to, I mean, they don't have to be 80, but if you go to people who've got through their CV bit, who are now and maybe their kids have got to a stage so they're not constantly making packed lunches and dragging kids to school. You then say, we really need you to help us. Actually, I think the evidence is that people say yes. And you've got to do it in a way that is helpful, but and again allows them to succeed. And the beautiful thing about the Vaccine Task Force is we were put in a position where we were allowed to succeed, and the way that decisions were taken was much quicker than normal. And we didn't take the decisions; it was all still done by ministers. So we didn't actually change the way. The underlying things that were done, but we just accelerated it massively, and so it is possible, and I think you just have to ask.
Okay, thank you. I know there are still some hands in the room, but I think we are pretty much out of time, but I'm sure we'll have some time for conversation and further discussions over drinks later, and it's quite nice to end on eulogy virtues. I think that's a brilliant tactic. So thank you both again. I'm going to hand over to Francisco for some final words.
Thank you very much, for this wonderful discussion. And
sorry, we're
you can
sitting
stay
down or we're
around.
staying?
No, you can stay around.
Stay.
This is going to be,
Yes.
just to close down. Yeah. I mean, so just 2 or 3 elements that I wanted to stress. So first, start to thank our speakers today, starting with Kate, but also our panel participants and all of you that joined here today, and also the team that's been involved in building the institute. I mean. And this is one of the aspects that's very important. I mean, you've heard already, the motivation for why we're doing these and the commitment that it exists. And I think one of the wonderful things about the Institute is precisely this notion that, if you go back to the mission of Imperial that Mary talked about in the opening remarks and wanting to make a difference in these big problems in society, I mean, that's really at the heart of the motivation for the creation of this Institute. In a very applied way, actually trying to put in place a framework for what Kate was mentioning about how you get the academics to think beyond the next grant, but also support them. Because one of the very important elements is that you got to get the right framework, because if there's not that help with support, I mean, that's what they're used to, because they have to support their group. They have to think about their own milestones. And so if we don't create that framework, it's, you're not going to be able to do that, right? It's not just about telling them, it's about doing it. And this is a very important element, which is to think about this deep tech, not only because we believe very much in the technology that exists at Imperial and the power that it has to change the world, but then to create those conditions to actually move the frameworks that exist at Imperial, the structure of support, and hopefully to also drive that impact. That's ultimately the motivation. That's one important element. But the other very important element is also to think about our mission as educators, right? I mean, the Institute is also about learning. It's also about teaching. It's also about disseminating. It's to think that if we're able to create the right environment to do this at Imperial, and we do believe that we have the right ingredients to do so, is also to spread the word. Because as we heard also about, I mean, it's not something that's going to be resumed at Imperial, and it's not going to make a difference if it's only about Imperial. But if we are successful, then thinking about it in a way that we can share with others what we're doing and involve others in what we're doing, then we're also fulfilling our other mission of the university, which is to teach, to learn, to engage, and to disseminate. And that's a very important element also of the Institute, to think and to go beyond that in a very important way, and to do that collaboratively. And the final part has to do with the ecosystem here. I mean, we are creating the institute as an opportunity to be this focal point, and to do that very collaborative across the university, and which is something that's very important. You know, we have Peter and David right here that have been, and others that have been very involved in building this. It is truly something that has been built across the university, but it's also something that we're building across the ecosystem, because this is something that, as we incorporate firms, as we go beyond, as we scale them up, it goes beyond what happens just at Imperial. It has to be building on this ecosystem. That's why we're also doing, you know, the launch here at White City and at the space of Imperial, to really engage with the broader community and to make it that this is something that we want to do collaboratively and in partnership, something that also Kate, you know, very, very well illustrated in her talk. So thank you very much for coming. Please join us after now for the continued conversation that Mary talked about in a reception right here, and also learn something about some of the projects that we are starting to support as part of the institute. And so delighted to have you, and enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was absolutely fantastic.
Is that all right?
Fantastic.